Well, council staff, attendees, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to present the preliminary findings from the most recent task force. This task force was formed as a response to the social unrest surrounding injustice and inequality around the country. As I noted in my response on my social media page to the death of George Floyd, and much like many others in my position have made, my statement was that I vowed to make sure that these words weren't hollow, that it was something where we would actually have a conversation and make a commitment towards hearing what our community wants and finding a pathway forward. But to have hard conversations, to look inside of ourselves and inside of our police department and inside of our community to not only educate ourselves, but listen and to find that pathway forward was the objective of this task force. This wasn't done because we don't support the police. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And what you'll find from this committee was tremendous support for our police. And however, like each of us in our room, we all as a group always have to be willing to grow, to find better pathways forward, and to strive to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be. And I know that's what we as a council try to do, is we make decisions for this community each and every day. But I was saddened to hear from so many that this committee was formed as a mechanism to run a political agenda up a flagpole, that we didn't support the police, that we were going to defund the police, that gaslighters were put on this committee. And, for me, that was just, without anyone coming to ask these questions or to find out what was actually going on, even the police, when they got a look at who was actually on this committee, told me they were impressed with the people that were selected, that these were people that were informed, engaged, and people that they would respect some of their opinions from, what we were looking at from a community. And, I can only assume that, some of this misinformation just comes from the same place it always does. But, I want to assure you all that none of those things were true, that this was truly to have a conversation. This was truly to understand what the community might want as we move forward, and some recommendations to move forward. And so, with that, this will all be public information after the meeting in the minutes, so that everyone will be able to review this quick brief that I put together. But the committee formed, basically, it consisted of youth, senior citizens, Republicans, Democrats, whites, blacks, Hispanics, Middle Easterners, men, women, community leaders, activists, and numerous graduates from the Citizens Police Academy. I think about 25% of the group on this committee had been involved with the Citizens Police Academy, because I did want to make sure that that voice was being heard, that we were hearing from people that understood in a little bit more depth, but also what did other community members hear, and what are they feeling and sharing, and what are their experiences. And so I wanted to engage a broad range of people from the city of Farmers Branch. And truly, the committee members that were on this task force, 98% of them come from the city of Farmers Branch, and in some way, shape, or form. And I'm glad to say that, there were no outsiders, there was no undue influence. It was truly, you live here, you grew up here, you had experience here, you've engaged with the police in some way, shape, or form, and engaged in this community, and I wanted to hear what you had to say. And so, with that, some of the derived themes that came from the conversations, I'm going to step back real quick. The first conversation was just the committee as a whole. Chief Hale wasn't in there. There was no one else. I wanted to make sure that we had a room where people felt comfortable sharing their experiences, sharing their comments, sharing their ideas, in a way to where they might not feel stifled if they didn't want to step on someone's toes or say something that might be regarded as impolite or just uncharacteristic. And to open it up and allow that room, I think was a good thing, because a lot of it derived some great conversations. I took detailed notes that formed these derived themes, which then became the impetus for, or I guess the focus of the second meeting with the chief, to get more information, to understand the policies that we didn't understand, to hear the questions so that he could hear the questions that were asked that we didn't have answers to, so that the group as a whole could understand, that background and that which is the information they were seeking. And from that, one of the main things that came was education. What are we doing in terms of outreach? How are we reaching out to our public? Mental health. And it's not just how are we dealing with mental health issues with people out in the community of Farmers Branch, but it's also mental health with our officers. Is it just enough that we're looking into things only when instances occur, but how are we engaging with them more often? Because they are under a lot of stress. And with that comes situations where we need to maybe address some situations or give them an outlet to talk and work through some things, so that they are constantly, in a good state of mental health, and something that was looked at, but it was potentially, new divisions that could be formed, policy reform, which on the next slide I'll get to some of the actions that have already been taken, by the police chief and the police department in the city. Kind of customer relations, what are we doing in engagement with people on a go-forward basis? There was a lot of conversations around the hiring policies. Not only what does that detail, but what are some opportunities to improve? We talked about transparency. How can we get more information to the public and out into the people in a much more seamless way so that we can look at what's happening in real time and it's not just an annual report. We talked about, domestic violence and the fact that because of COVID and where we're at right now, things seem to be rising, not only, in the home, but with kids and everything else, and just something that we wanted to take a look at. There was some conversation about bail reform. Now, that doesn't directly relate to our police. That's something that's gonna happen in the courts. That's a completely different conversation. But this was something that came up that the community wanted to address, and also intrinsic bias. Misspelled that, that's okay. And, that came up too. What are we looking at in terms of training, and, is this potentially something that we could look at in hiring, and something we'll look at in, in the future here as we move through this presentation. But, what we're doing now, steps that we've already implemented, the duty to intervene. While our department has practiced this for years, it was most recently codified into our policy procedures. As I said, they've been doing it, but it wasn't on the books. It wasn't set policy. And so now that is. Same with chokehold bans. We've revised our position on chokehold bans and conversation with the police chief to understand that these are banned unless an officer is in a fight for his life or in a situation in combat. And that makes a lot of sense. That's perfectly a reasonable request. Like, if an officer is engaged with someone and he is fighting, he needs to be able to use any means necessary to not only protect himself, but to bring the assailant, down and under control. No-knock warrants, we talked about that recently. The position is we took a look at what we were doing there, made some adjustments, and upgraded the chain of command in terms of when we would implement situations like that. The Chief's Advisory Council is something that he will be forming. It is a trusted group of people that he will be able to bounce ideas off if there's a situation in the community. He will be able to discuss these items with them, understand what are some options that we might take, where might we go, but I just want to reiterate that this is an advisory council. In no way, shape, or form will they have control over the situation or provide the policy guiding what decisions are made. That truly and ultimately rests with our chief. Additionally, we've also implemented new transparency policies. We're going to be updating traffic stops, different ways that our officers are engaging with the community, and instead of that being that annual report that we receive every year, right now it's going to be updated quarterly so that we can look at that data in more real time. What do our arrests look like? Where are they coming from? Is it our citizens? Is it people outside of that? And what came from conversations is that 80% of the people stopped and ticketed in Farmers Branch don't live in Farmers Branch. But what do those demographics look like? Are we sharing that information, that it's not just our citizens getting pulled over, that we are truly patrolling and policing our area for anyone coming into the city? And I think that those are important information pieces to know. Additionally, education, and I don't want to touch on this too much. The next presentation will speak to the UNIDOS program, which the chief and Councilmember Ratana have definitely worked on. But what kind of outreach are we doing in our community? How are we engaging all of our community? And while Coffee with the Cop is great and the attendance is good, it typically seems to be the same people. So how are we going out to meet people where they are and engaging with an entire new subsect of our community to ensure that we're reaching out to the minority community, to those that are most vulnerable, to ensure that that engagement level and the conversation with the police is being had, because we have a lot of stuff to overcome. I mean, it's not just perception, it's also, what's being taught and passed down. How can we engage to move past, things in our history from, just different demographics and different experiences that, I might not ever understand, but that other people have experienced, to change that and change the ideals for which people are being educated on police and the services that they provide to our community and what they're doing to ensure that our community is safe and it's a great place to live. Where to go next? This is kind of a review for some things to maybe look at in the next year. And these would be things that, council would definitely need to weigh and consider. This committee was not formed as this is what we're going to do, this is the mandate. It is simply ideas and impressions from our community on different ways that they might want to be policed that council would need to take a look at, decide, or maybe we need to take a step back and look at things a little bit further. So, one of that was a mental health division. This would be bringing in mental health workers, social technicians, EMTs, other people that are partnering with our police, like we're seeing in Irving, like we're seeing in Dallas, like we're now seeing in Denton, that go out and provide, answer calls to people in crisis. People, are homeless, domestic violence disputes, other things where you might need someone to quell the situation, to provide a little bit, more comfort, because we can't expect our police officers to be everything. They can't be a psychologist, they can't be a social worker and a police officer at the same time. So how can we take some of those tasks, take some of those burdens and move them to a group that is focused on those initiatives, on the care, and provide that to our community. And, through that conversation came more about, what about our officers? And, after speaking with some of them, they understand that there's a lot of stress with their job, especially right now, an unfair amount of stress. And, one of the things that the chief brought up during this meeting was, wouldn't it be great if we could pair this mental health division, if it were ever to come to fruition, with a psychologist on staff or a therapist or someone that can see officers on a more frequent basis to talk through some of the difficulties going on with what they see in the streets, home life. It's a lot that we have to deal with, and we want to make sure that they're being taken care of, that it's not just, we're giving you all the gear that you need, but what do you need for your mental health, for wellness, and other things, and being sure that they are taken care of, because that's important. I think in the future, it's also what can we do to increase that transparency? I think we've taken a good step to at least start that process, but where can we get better? Where can we add, maybe a more robust dashboard that our public is able to engage with and understand, what's going on in real time in terms of our community and its policing. And also there was a lot of conversation in terms of customer relations and just, PR and, what are we doing in terms of reaching out and who's going to run these educational programs and how are we engaging with the public, and if there's a incident that needs follow-up or someone that is removed kind of from the case but is there to guide people through it, that might be an opportunity for a position for someone to handle these types of situations. And it's also more engagement. It's working with the community, and, let's say it's Police Month. A great idea came up was, from Councilman Ratana, how are we sharing more details? How are we encouraging more people during that month to understand, what our police does, to have those things ready to go so that, we're constantly engaging and having more of a presence in the community than what we have now. And then enhanced equipment. I look at, if we're protecting the mind, we got to also protect the body. And some of the gear that our officers currently wear now could be better. Councilmember Blackson did a great job by providing the load-bearing vests that come from the shoulders that carry, all the officers' equipment kind of at the bottom of that takes the strain off of their hips and, moves it to a place where it's more stable and sturdy. But it's also looking at more license plate readers on entrances to our community, which have been a huge boost to our police officers and to finding criminals and providing safety, that we should probably expand this to other areas of our community where we're seeing opportunities to implement that. But it's also additional technology that we could be using. How can we help them, in their efforts by being smarter and using things that, are constantly there that help them do their job. And, I think about ShotSpotter. It's a technology that when someone fires a gun, if you have 3 sensors in an area, it triangulates within 30 seconds to 5 feet to where a gun was fired. So, and that's every time a gun's fired. So it's not a sound, it's not a gun, it's not going to recognize that, but it does make those calls easier to respond to and quicker rather than people just posting on Nextdoor. I think I heard a gunshot, but I'm not sure. This type of technology is out there, it's available, it's stuff I think we should explore. And maybe it's not the next year, maybe it's just in the future, but something that we need to constantly be thinking about, as we have tools and equipment that can help us and be more efficient. And so with future considerations, this is more of what's long term, what isn't kind of what can we do next year, where do we need to go, but it's in the spirit of there's other things out there that were discussed during this meeting. There was a push for how do we have more bilingual officers, to make sure that, people when they're stopped, we don't have to call for the translator, that, there's always someone on shift, or, how do we ensure that more of our officers speak Spanish, given that 50% of our community essentially is Hispanic. And so the odds of running into those situations, and when you think about it, 80% of the people being stopped aren't from our community. In Dallas County, in the North Texas region, those numbers are rising to where we need to know Spanish, on a bigger level. And, is there an opportunity to increase incentives for our officers for learning Spanish to where it's a one-time bigger payment, but also keep the incentive pay on the back end? It's potentially exploring intrinsic bias testing. While the studies are still preliminary, there's been a lot of psychological studies out there from Harvard and several other institutions that are looking at intrinsic bias on the front end through a series of tests that allow us to understand where someone might be on that scale that could be a decision in terms of the hiring process on the front end, so that we're making sure that, we're starting from a benchmark or base level that we find acceptable, that, hey, from here we can go, and with additional training, we can kind of work to erode that. You're never really going to get rid of it, but you could erode it through, just different mechanisms and trainings that we have. And, I do want to, Chief, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but our officers do about 120 hours of training a year. Is it 150?
So average is 120, we're only required 20.
Yeah, so just so you all know, our officers do 120 hours of training on average with the requirement of 20, and a lot of these things are in there. So we do a great job of ensuring that our officers informed, they understand policies, tactics, procedures, but in terms of where else we need to go, I think there are other opportunities in terms of the hiring process that could add another level that just ensures that situations where bias might be in the situation could hopefully all be eliminated. Additionally, a recommendation that I'm going to make is next year when we look at our comp study, potentially adding a step and pay increase from 20 to 25 that would put our officers in their final 5 years towards the highest end of the spectrum. That is something a council will have to decide. I'm just putting that recommendation out there. Bail reform and procedures, that'll obviously be a conversation with our judge, something that needs to be done in the future, just where we're at, what are our procedures, what are we looking at, what type of reform might need to be done. It's an additional and continual education outreach, looking for ways to constantly improve and engage with our community to ensure that the message is getting out there, that we're breaking down barriers and walls and really building a relationship between our community and our officers. There's been talks of social workers at the library as a potential additional service where people can get help there. This program's been seen and worked in other communities, and then additional just diversity inclusion initiatives that the city could take a look at in terms of different contracts and other things, because this conversation, while centered around the police, is a bigger conversation about a lot of those topics, and just want to make sure that we're not losing sight of that and that there's other things that need to be done. And so, that's kind of where the conversations went. That was a lot of the input and ideas that came from this community group, and things that I just wanted to share as kind of a brief with council about the recommendations that kind of came of things that we might need to look at. As I said, this isn't supposed to be a mandate. This isn't, we're going to need to march this up the flagpole. It was, here are the thoughts and ideas from our community in terms of what we should probably look at, and here's already what we've done. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up to questions. I know